Hello and welcome to video lecture series in political science. Today we are going to discuss chapter 2 titled as End of Bipolarity from your class 12th textbook Contemporary World Politics. As you know that for understanding we have divided this chapter into 4 parts. So far in the first 3 parts we have discussed what is bipolarity, what was Soviet Union, what were the features of Soviet economy, what were the problems with the Soviet system, and how Soviet system started to collapse after early 1980s onwards. We have also discussed about the reforms that Gorbachev initiated. Today in this part we will discuss about consequences of the disintegration of the USSR, we will discuss about shock therapy, and we will also discuss briefly about India's relations with the communist countries. Now, as you know that though Gorbachev was right in identifying the problems that had plagued the Soviet system, and he also attempted to reform it, but while doing this Gorbachev was caught between the two groups demanding opposite types of actions. When Gorbachev started reforms, he had loosened the grip over the Soviet system. This led to rise in the expectation of the people who were demanding change for a long period of time. Some sections felt that Gorbachev should have moved faster than what he was doing. These people had become impatient and they wanted to achieve too much too quickly. Whereas on the other hand, the members of the Communist Party, those who had enjoyed power and privilege for a long period of time, thought that Gorbachev is moving too fast. So Gorbachev was caught between the two and he lost the support from both the sides. And even those who were with him thought that he could not defend his own policies when it came to change. So, along with the internal problems of the Russian Federation, there was a rise in the spirit of nationalism also and a desire for sovereignty among the republics of the Soviet Union, particularly Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia. These are the Baltic countries, and Ukraine and Georgia in the middle. If we try to analyze the reasons for disintegration of the Soviet Union, we get very controversial answers. What has happened? People say that during the period of reforms initiated by Gorbachev, it was thought that these reforms have further increased the dissatisfaction among people. So, some people say that he should not have introduced these at all. And this dissatisfaction came to a point that governments could not control it. During the Cold War, many people had thought that the Central Asian republics, which were highly diverse ethnically and religiously, will demonstrate the strongest unrest and will demand for nationalism. However, on the contrary, surprisingly, the spirit of nationalism and disintegration within the Soviet Union was strongest in the prosperous part of the Union, that is, in Russia, in Baltic region, Ukraine and Georgia, because these areas were close to Europe. One perspective says that this situation happened because ordinary people in the Soviet Union felt that they paid too high an economic price to keep the backward areas of Central Asia within the Soviet Union, and hence these people got alienated. The disintegration of the Soviet Union and the collapse of Second World changed the nature of world politics forever. What were these changes? Let us have a look at them briefly. The first important change was that the collapse of Soviet system meant the end of ideological war over socialism and capitalism. It also implied end of Cold War confrontations. Since both the rival blocs were engaged in the arms race against each other and accumulation of nuclear weapons to prove their superiority to the other, the end of confrontation or the end of communism could be seen as the end of confrontation, and it demanded the end of arms race as well. The second important consequence was that the world after the collapse of Soviet Union became unipolar. Earlier it was bipolar because there were two rival powers. The power relations between different nations in the world politics also changed. Now from bipolarity, as the chapter is titled as fall of or end of bipolarity, the world became unipolar. Politically, the notion of liberal democracy and free market espoused by the Western Bloc emerged as the best way to organize political and economic life. It was also called as triumph of capitalism. With capitalist economy becoming the dominant economic system world over, US became dominant ideologically, and the US became the sole superpower. So the world became unipolar. And with no other country or group of countries being strong enough to create a multipolar system, the end of bipolarity led to superiority of the Western bloc, particularly superiority of the US and unipolarity. The countries which were liberated from the occupation of Soviet Union and the other republics that were part of the Union once also adopted capitalist form of economy. The US became dominant and played a powerful role in international organizations such as the United Nations, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, that is IMF. The third important consequence of the collapse was that with the disintegration of Soviet bloc, many new countries emerged. These countries had their own set of aspirations, identities, challenges, economic and political structures. Some of these countries, particularly countries in the Eastern Europe, wanted to join the European Union and become part of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The Central Asian countries, because of their geographical location being close to Russia, they continued to have close relations with Russia. But they also established their ties with the US, China and other countries which they were not doing when they were part of the Eastern Bloc. The fall of Berlin Wall marked the beginning of a process of transformation of Central and Eastern European countries. Now, this transformation involved transformation in all the spheres of society. Let us list 4 spheres. The first one is the political transition from one party authoritarian state to a democracy. The second transition happened in the economic sphere, that is the economic transition from centrally planned Soviet socialist economies to capitalist economies. The third change happened in the form of identity of these nations, that is identity transition. This was a change in the status from being a satellite state of the Russia to an independent nation state, sovereign nation state. And fourth was diplomatic transition, that is reintegration of their newly independent nation with the West and becoming part of the international system now. But this process of transition was full of problems and challenges, and these challenges and problems together are known as shock therapy. As the name suggests, shock therapy, it was very difficult for newly formed countries to embrace the changes after the fall of Soviet type of socialist economic institutions. The intensity and speed of shock therapy varied among all these nations, but all of them almost were moving in a similar direction. What was this direction? First, they were all required to completely change the socialist type of economic structure and adopt capitalism. This means adoption of private ownership of property. The second aspect of economic change was the privatization of the assets owned by the state. For example, say so far airlines, banks, railways, postal services, telecommunications were owned by the state. Now they were being opened up for private players to enter and do business. The third important economic change was the replacement of collective farming by private farming. So far it was collective farming, but now the land was being given to the private owners to develop and cultivate. Shock therapy involved development of free trade and allowing foreign investment in a country, opening up of economy, deregulation, disinvestment and currency convertibility. You might read some of these concepts in the subject of economics. As this transition occurred, there was a change in the nature and direction of trade alliances also among the countries of the Soviet bloc. They were becoming part of the Western economic system and were directly or indirectly guided and controlled by various agencies and institutions such as IMF and World Bank, because they were taking loans for the development from these international bodies. Now, shock therapy happened and it had certain consequences. Let us take a look at what were the consequences of the shock therapy. So, shock therapy refers to the kind of problems and challenges these newly independent nations faced after getting disintegrated or separated from the USSR. Now, what were the consequences of shock therapy? One important one was that the economic, political, ideological and social transformation that happened did not deliver what it was expected to deliver. It led to ruin of economies and disaster in the region. The industries in these countries or in these regions were put up for sale, and this sale is called as the largest garage sale in history. The industries were sold at throwaway prices to the buyers, those who wanted to buy them and bring life back into these dead industries. Although all citizens were given vouchers to participate in the sale, but most of them sold their vouchers in the black to get money, because money was not available with anybody. The value of Russian currency ruble came down drastically. As the rate of inflation grew, people lost their savings also. With collapse of collective farming, the production of food grains came down, and Russia started importing food from the other parts of the world. In such a scenario, the middle class was pushed to the margins, and the intellectual class, wherever they could, fled away to other countries. The old trading system and economic structure broke down before the new could have been established firmly. That was the problem with the shock therapy. In the capitalist form of economy, the old system of social security was also reduced. Government withdrew subsidies and social securities. As you remember that in socialism, every citizen was a responsibility of the state, and state was taking care of many of the needs of the citizens like health, education, pension, security, etc. But in this case, government withdrew subsidies and social security. A large number of people went below the poverty line. Privatization of economy led to economic disparities among social classes. And interestingly, mafia emerged in most of these countries that controlled many of the economic activities and took control of many of the cartels. Now, unlike the past, the new regions had great inequality between the people. In the process of managing the economic transformation, the political transition did not receive much attention because the society had to transform itself politically and economically. But economic crisis was so acute that the political transition did not receive much attention. The so-called new democracies now, those who were out of the authoritarian systems and adopted democracies, they drafted their constitutions in a very hurried manner. The parliaments were weak. The multi-party system had not evolved because so far they had a rule of a single party or a single leader. The presidents or head of the new states were strong and they had most of the power. Many of the Central Asian countries became authoritarian regimes, like the president of Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan appointed themselves for 10 years and they later extended it for another 10 years. That is, for 20 years they are going to rule non-stop. They allowed no opposition and held absolute power in their hands. The judiciary, individual freedom and liberty could not flourish under such regimes. But however, after initial phase of struggle, most of these countries started to gain control of their economic and political conditions, say after a decade or 10 years. Things started improving when they started to export natural resources like minerals, oils and gas. The republics in Central Asia are rich in oil resources. Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Russia, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan are major oil and gas producers in the world. They are the main exporters to many of the countries in Asia and Europe. The economic growth slowly started to revive itself in the region. The other regions connected to these regions also gained because of being in the transit route from where the oil or gas pipelines went. Many external powers or players are also in competition with one another to gain entry into this region. The region lies strategically between Russia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, India and China. Over a period of time, manufacturing also started to gain momentum. But most of these former Soviet republics, despite coming back on the track economically, since then are facing a lot of instability, civil unrest and ethnic conflict. The situation has never been very peaceful for a long period of time. These conflicts have led to so much of instability in the region that it has made life difficult for common people. The involvement of other people or other powers in the conflict with their vested interest makes the situation further complex. Let us look at some of these conflicts briefly. First, there is a secessionist movement that has happened in the two Russian republics of Chechnya and Dagestan. Dagestan has high ethnic and linguistic diversity and is home to more than 30 languages. It has rich oil reserves and strong manufacturing sector, but there is rampant corruption and organized crime that is holding the growth back. Dagestan's politics is dominated by the need to balance many of its ethnic groups, and a long running militant Islamist insurgency has become a major problem for the country. Tajikistan too witnessed a civil war for almost a decade after becoming independent state. Another example is that attempting to join Armenia, some of the people from Nagorno-Karabakh province of Azerbaijan have entered into conflict. In Georgia also there was a demand for independence. Similar conflicts have been happening in Ukraine and Kyrgyzstan. Apart from these secessionist movements, civil war, conflict between local communities, etc., there have been conflicts over resources among people as well, such as conflict over sharing of river water or access to other resources. Interestingly, after 9/11, the US wanted to establish military base in the region. The US also paid these states to use their airspace and airports to carry out raids on Afghanistan and Iraq. On the other hand, Russia treats these countries in Central Asia as its near abroad. Russia intends to retain its influence over them. Similarly, China is also interested in the oil resources of the region. China is a developing country, it wants to make itself secure energy-wise. China has also started to develop the area around the border to conduct trade with them. If you look at the countries in the Eastern Europe, these were the part of the erstwhile USSR. Now, if we look at the countries in the Eastern Europe, which were part of the Eastern Bloc, then Czechoslovakia got divided into two independent nations, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. But Yugoslavia in the Balkan region witnessed one of the most severe conflicts, which also has been labeled as a genocide. After 1991 death of Tito, Yugoslavia got divided into 6 provinces: Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Macedonia, Montenegro and Serbia. Now, this is the story of the countries or the nations that got liberation from the USSR or those who came out from the Russian domination in the Eastern Europe. Let us now discuss about a relationship between India and the post-communist countries. Now, as you know that India was non-aligned country during the Cold War. After end of Cold War and fall of communism, India has maintained good relations with all the post-communist countries. As we have learned in chapter 1 that despite claiming to be non-aligned, India had signed a treaty of friendship with Russia in 1971. That shows that India was inclined towards the socialist system. Among all these post-communist countries, the strongest relations India has are with Russia. The relationship with Russia is an important aspect of India's foreign policy as well. And it has continued since the Nehruvian era and is built upon a history of trust and common interest between both the nations. Both India and Russia share a common vision. The vision includes a multipolar world, not a unipolar or bipolar world. What does this mean? It means that they envisage or imagine a kind of international system where many powers coexist peacefully rather than domination of one power. They imagine that there is a greater regionalism and there is idea of collective security, and the settlement of conflict between nations is done through negotiations rather than through use of force, as it was done during the Cold War. Both of them also believe in independent foreign policies of the sovereign nation. They agree that decision-making capacity of international bodies like the UN should be strengthened, democratized and empowered. That is, the developing nations should have more say in such international bodies. In fact, India stands to benefit from good relations with Russia. How? India looks for support from Russia on important and strategic issues like Kashmir issue, combating international terrorism, energy security, information sharing, technological development, trade, import and export. Moreover, Having good relations with Russia will also help to balance the rise of China in the region. And India, by having good relations with Russia, will also have access to the Central Asian region. But this benefit is not just one way, that is, it's not just India which stands to benefit. Russia too stands to benefit from this relationship. How? India is the second largest arms market for Russia. Indian military imports most of its equipment and hardware from Russia. To fulfill its energy requirements, India depends upon the countries in the Middle East and Russia, although recently only Russia has started exporting energy to India. Russia is important to India for its energy security, and India is seeking to increase its imports from Russia and republics of Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. Apart from these, there are partnerships and collaborations happening in the field of nuclear energy, space programs and various other scientific projects. The Soviet Union then had assisted India in establishment of many public sector enterprises. It provided economic aid and technical assistance for steel plants in Bhilai, Bokaro and Visakhapatnam. And it also provided technical support for heavy machinery plants like BHEL, Bharat Heavy Electrical Limited. The Soviet Union had also supported India's position in the UN on Kashmir issue. It had provided military help during war with Pakistan in 1971. Another important aspect is in the field of media and culture. Interesting to note that Hindi films and culture is very popular in Russia and many of the states which were part of the Russia till date. The passion for Hindi films is high among people in all these republics of Russia, particularly in Uzbekistan. And one of the shopkeepers said that within months of release of new movies, Hindi movies, the markets are flooded with the original as well as pirated copies of these films. One of the shopkeepers said that almost 70% people in Tashkent buy these films to watch. They know many of the famous Indian film stars and can even sing popular Hindi songs. Many of the schools in Russia offer Hindi as an optional subject. So, India has been having close relations with the post-Soviet countries. During the Cold War era also, India enjoyed a special relationship with Russia, and this relationship has remained multidimensional since then. To conclude, let's summarize this chapter in all. In this chapter, which is titled as End of Bipolarity, we discussed about what is meant by bipolarity and the fall of communism. We discussed about what was Soviet system, what were the features of Soviet economy, what were the main problems with the Soviet system, what reforms did Gorbachev initiate, and why did the USSR disintegrate. We also discussed about what were the consequences of disintegration of the USSR on world politics and economy of these nations. We discussed about shock therapy and India's position during the post-Cold War era. So, this is about bipolarity. Enjoy reading this chapter. Thank you.